Hi everyone.
Good evening.
We're just a couple of minutes late. We still have trouble with our technology, even having run a test, but hopefully the sound is working okay this time. Fingers crossed. Please write something in the comments if our sound is at all crackly.
And let us know if the video is blurry because from this end it looks crystal clear, but maybe not from your end.
Well, let's get started. So, before I get to tonight's topic, I was just going to mention our upcoming immersion retreat, which starts in 3 weeks today. And we do have a couple of spots still available. We have a nice group assembled, so it'll be fun. But if anyone watching us is still thinking about it, please get in touch as soon as you can. It starts on Sunday, the 26th of April. And we have just listed a weekend retreat in mid-June at Queenscliff, and we'll be putting a bit more about that on our social media channels.
Our weekend treats
Retreat.
focuses on the food, and there's a lot of hands-on cooking workshops, demonstrations, and much lighter on us giving you lectures.
So the 7-day immersion is in the Yarra Valley, and it's with our chef Julia Gruskin, who does an amazing job
And
at
our
feeding
immersion
us.
partner, Dr. Peter Johnston, dietitian.
And our weekend retreat at Queenscliff is with our former immersion partner, Anita Ricky, who will be doing the cooking and the cooking demonstrations. So that's in mid-June. Okay, so thank you for confirming that you can hear us okay after our disaster and the last time we did a live stream. I just hope the video is okay. It looks really clear to us, but when we did a test run, the replay was a bit strange. So I don't know if that was just YouTube or the internet. Anyway,
It could be
we
complimentary.
can't do anything about it now because we're live and we're pressing on.
It may reduce a few skin lines if it's blurry, Jenny, for me.
So, our topic for tonight is why believe us? Now, this is something that we've pondered this question for quite some time. We could also say, why trust us? In the context of so much confusion in the nutrition space at the moment. And we even we see the confusion within people who are following a whole food plant-based diet, which is the the dietary pattern that we recommend. We see a lot of confusion, and so we started writing, or Malcolm did the writing, for our newsletter, which went out just yesterday. If anyone didn't get it, then get in touch and. Or go to our main website, Whole Food Plant-Based Health, and subscribe to our channel, and I'll subscribe to our mailing list, and I will then send you a newsletter. Anyway, Malcolm started writing a few paragraphs for the newsletter, but it got a bit longer than that, and I said that this is going to have to be an article on our website, and the newsletter will just start it off and link to it. So that's what we did. But I might get you to kind of take it from here about how we've been dealing with this question and why.
Yeah, and it might sound a bit, egotistical, like, hey, you should be listening to us, but it's not. It's a very serious thing. Like, why would anyone believe and trust what we say in promoting, whole, your standard SOS-free, whole, low-fat, mostly whole foods, plant-based diet, for which there's so much evidence. It's because there's so many nutrition voices. Actually, I think partly what triggered this is there's noticeably less people out there who are sort of wanting to come and do our events. And this is not just, a sales marketing thing. And we're sort of thinking, what's happening out there? Like, are we a bit on the nose? And it's like, no, there are just so many other voices out there. You
It's
know,
not just our events, it's getting people along to the potluck meetups. We get a nice crowd, but it's not really growing.
no, and some other cities are having difficulty, getting a quorum to actually run their plant-powered events. Um, Look,
Oh,
there.
and also globally, there's the feedback that plant-based diets are on the decline. Companies that started out plant-based products, not ones that we'd necessarily recommend, are not succeeding. They're going under. So
No, they're backing off supermarket shelves in
it's a
some
global
places. That
trend away from plant-based diets. And also a rise in consumption of meat. We've had that confirmed in Australia and certainly in the USA. So I
and across
imagine
the
that's across
world,
the
meat
world.
consumption has increased, particularly red meat. Um, and then of course, I think the US dietary guidelines that have triggered some of this. It's like they really smash vegan diets. Apparently, we're going to run out of carotenoids and magnesium and some of the nutrients that actually are more amply supplied by plant-based foods. Um, so the other nutrition voices out there, while we're sort of like could be seen as, old school, still stuck on their low fat, whole foods, plant-based diet based on whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, and smaller amounts of nuts and seeds. But the main voices out there, in fact, even the mainstream is, oh, be careful of those carbs. Oh, no, some are okay, but don't eat too many of them, unless you need a lot of energy. Meanwhile, you know, we're evidence-based. We're promoting what the science says. It says eat more whole grains and legumes, most of which are actually quite high in carbohydrate. Now we have got some allies in Australia, like Doctors for Nutrition. If you're not a member or looking at their website and their education events, have a look at Doctors for Nutrition. So all the other nutrition voices out there in Australia, the low carb message is very strong, and the protein, that's really like they eat more protein is everywhere. And I guess the other part of that message is, the rise of big oil and olive oil, and why wouldn't you eat Evo, extra virgin olive oil? Even and I think what's happened is the meat and dairy industry, egg industry, and now the new big olive oil industry, which is big, they're really winning. And they've been working on this for, I don't know, at least a couple of decades. Any comments on that, Jenny?
Well, how are they winning? There's two main fronts. The key one, which is how they convince health professionals in Australia and across the world, is that they fund research, and they fund researchers in universities and other research organisations to conduct research that is going to find their product in a favourable light. And there's been so much research into things like, in particularly protein. I've been tracking this for back over the last 20 years, and I think we find it, I wouldn't say amusing, but the fact that when we hear people in the plant-based world being really focused on protein and making sure people eat more protein at certain ages and stages and levels of fitness, is it's been the meat industry in particular, but also the dairy industry, who've been funding research to try and muddy the waters, make out that they need more protein, and in all those sort of life stages. And so it's sort of like a con, isn't it? So there's the funding
Yeah,
of
and it's
research.
influenced plant-based people as well, who are suddenly worried about their protein
Yeah.
and suddenly, eating ultra-processed sources of protein, like protein powders, for example.
So the other way they do it is through lobbying, and this was exposed last year. I think the Guardian newspaper had a big article about the lobbyists that had worked on. We talked last month that we did a live stream on the Eat Lancet 2. When Eat Lancet, the commission paper, the first one came out about 7 years ago, that the meat industry and other industries lobbied hard to kind of discredit the messenger. So scientists were like discredited. What's the word? They and also just to create, to sort of smash the social media space, so that there's a lot of commentary around. They talked about the creation of conspiracy theories that they're trying to control us. They're trying to stop us eating our meat, and to create a lot of fear around that.
And some people even pointed a finger at the quite a lot of work in the US has been done within the Seventh-day Adventist community, and we know many Adventists in the US who are right on top of the healthy, whole foods, plant-based living. And there's been, some people who are sort of saying, this is just sort of, your religious position, which is not true at all.
Well, the other thing is that I recall this being accused of the key researcher on the Eat Lancet research, accused of being plant-based himself, and as though that's worthy of being discredited. It's like, we can be accused of being biased because we're plant-based, and we're therefore promoting the plant-based diet.
This is a bit of a problem, because if someone really understands whole foods plant-based and really embraces it and goes, look, I've looked into all the evidence, and then some influencer or person or lobbyist comes along and says, don't listen to that person who's looked at all the research and gone completely plant-based, because they're obviously biased because they're completely plant-based. It's a bit of a circular argument.
It is, yeah. And yes, Anita, food is fashion, so people are very sensitive around food. But we always come back to the science, and that's what the Eat Lancet Commission was about. What scientific evidence for sustaining the population and the planet.
Eat Lancet really laid out a roadmap for how we could sustainably feed, a world population of 10 billion people a relatively healthy diet. And they actually laid out the roadmap based on hardcore science in nutrition. And hey, it wasn't all that type of nutrition. It wasn't totally plant-based, and they didn't like potatoes. But they really did make a big effort to actually lay out the science, and the science behind, looking at agriculture, and particularly a lot of environmental science, and the planetary boundaries that we can't keep exceeding, like water extraction, or we'll end up in a environmental disaster if we're not already in one. But I won't be a doomer.
And to come back to the industry funding of research, and that's how it can be that very educated people will be advocating. They'll see the research paper that says olive oil is good for cardiovascular disease, funded by the olive oil industry, and so on. And so it looks really legitimate until you take a really close look at the design of the research and the findings. I think you're going to talk a bit about
the
clinical
we'll come back to that. And I think at this point we'll go, okay, so who can we believe? Who can we trust? Well, one thing is you can look at qualifications, although immediately I think of Nathan Pritikin, who was one of the really earlier people in this movement, but he was actually an engineer. But then we can look at the other side of the coin, where in Australia we have a number of very high-profile people high-profile medical specialists, for example, some very vocal ones who get platforms too, and they've got qualifications. Like if you're an expert on beep, I'm not going to name which part of the body, and you've done a lot of really good work in your career and really helped a lot of people, but maybe you've got no training of nutrition, and you just, and you're looking at diabetes and you're going, well, yeah, blood sugar goes up, it's obviously the carbohydrates. And it's like, what? No, it's insulin resistance, and we know it's causing that, and it's the very meat and dairy and egg foods that you're recommending. So we've got this issue. We've got some very high-profile docs in Australia really pushing this low-carb movement along, and their qualifications, might look good. They might be beep, highly credentialed, but they're not actually trained in nutrition. Where does that put us then? Well, without boasting about it, I mean, I've got a medical degree. We've both, done some university nutrition at Deakin University and had some training there.
Malcolm's was back in the 90s by correspondence.
That's right. Yeah, I did 8 semesters. Jenny more recently did a grad cert. I've done lifestyle medicine certification with mostly US-based education that, looks at very much at the plant-based. We've done lots of other little courses. Jenny's...
We go to the conference every year in plant-based nutrition.
We've been to like a dozen international conferences in the US on this. Jenny's done some coaching courses. But, it's not just qualifications. It's also experience. And I think in looking at who do we trust, well, yeah, we do trust people who have looked at the research and the evidence. That's certainly a big thing we look at. But we also there are people who've newly come into this area, and they've read lots of research papers and summaries of them. But that's about all. So we're often interested in people who have experience, like people like Caldwell Esselstyn, who've treated hundreds and hundreds of people with severe heart disease.
Hundreds is what he published.
Thousands. The late Dr. McDougall, thousands of people. But also who have had some continuity. And that is, you can be some particular specialist who have found this, and you see patients once or twice as a specialist, and that's about it. But I think we'd sort of put more trust in someone who has treated people over a period of time and seen what works and what
doesn't work.
What practices and what sort of advice and things doesn't work. Like, a little, for example, we've found that a little bit of oil or a little bit of dairy often doesn't work because of the way it's interpreted.
Or a focus on healthy fats can have people eating, even in the whole food plant-based arena, a very high-fat diet, and they don't often get the results that they're looking for. So,
yeah. So that when we're looking who to trust, sometimes people like McDougall and Ornish, who have run programs, and Neil Barnard's been involved in quite a few research programs where they've followed people for a long period of time and seen what actually works, both in what people do, but also in how you advise them and things. So I think we've been in the area for long enough to understand the controversies and some of the nuances of nutrition. Like, we're not always absolutist about everything, but we'll tend to sort of give you advice and give our sort of distilled version of what we'd recommend, and let our participants or patients decide how closely they follow that. And so we understand some of the uncertainties too. When I said I can't be absolutist about some things. Now, as far as being evidence-based and science-based, look, that's really important, and we're big on that. But you can be shackled by being too sort of, I am all evidence-based. I mean, in medicine, if you're totally evidence-based, you'd go, well, where's the randomized controlled trials showing that smoking causes lung cancer? And it's like, there's this research from all different areas showing it, but we never did a big randomized controlled trial. So, we don't always have the evidence. So we feel like it's not always the best approach to be totally shackled about what there have been studies that are looked at and what they haven't. One example is so many people in our own experience of treating patients, in the experience of others, in the experience of people like Clint Patterson, who treat people with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, eating oil seems to really trigger arthritis. Now, I can't fully explain why, and I'm not sure how many studies have looked at this, but that's one example. I guess another one is I've got a high degree of confidence that a low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet is going to be really beneficial and even reverse polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. Yeah, we haven't got the good quality, randomized controlled trial. But we can look at all those sort of mechanisms and go, yeah, it ticks the box there. Yeah. Usually it's involved. There's a lot of insulin resistance in there, whether or not the person has a lot of excess weight or not. So we can sort of start to look at some of those factors and say, look, this biologically would make sense. We've got all the bits and pieces, and we sort of understand how medicine understands how disease works. And so it might be an example of how we'll sort of go a little bit beyond the published science.
Can I just interject in a sort of an opposite sense that when you hear of someone talking about research, and we particularly seem to hear people talking about, say, some of the olive oil research, where they talk, and I've watched stuff on YouTube in the last month where some very, very esteemed researchers have been talking about this, about, what was it, 9 grams of oil, and not specifically olive oil, was, I'm actually forgotten what the benefit was.
There was it looked at the Harvard Health Studies data, and it looked at oil consumption, and the paper that was written had all the things about why extra virgin olive oil is so good. And the paper looked at people who ate, I think it might have been at least 7 grams
it was a very small amount.
Olive oil a day versus not eat it.
Yeah.
From what they could interpret from the diet diaries, it didn't even in those days differentiate between extra virgin and plain olive oil. Now, found there was decreased deaths from a number of different conditions like heart disease, diabetes, maybe respiratory disease, all cause death. But it was like, this brings up that thing about.
Well, the thread I want to sort of come back to is the what's the mechanism by which such a tiny amount of oil compared to no oil could have such an impact on this mortality data? And in a sense, it doesn't make sense. But this is where if there's sort of industry tentacles in research, and God help us with AI getting hold of those massive cohort databases, how you could trawl the data looking for something until you find a benefit.
Anyway, in that particular study, certainly the olive oil won over mayonnaise and butter and dairy fat. Came out equal to any polyunsaturated vegetable oil actually in that study that was presented as evidence for why for olive oil.
Anyway, go on.
And so just as we look at some sort of areas and think, well, we're sort of going to extrapolate into PCOS even though we haven't got the study. There are other areas where we look at where there's been a very limited number of studies, maybe one with an amazing result, like Brazil nuts will lower 4 Brazil nuts will lower cholesterol for a month. And we go, you know what? We need a bit of a biological mechanism here. We need to sort of have an explanation of just what's the logic and why this might work. And if we haven't got that logic, we'll just assume that industry did something a bit dodgy with Brazil nut studies, or that this was just a very random finding. And here's where we look at findings. And another confusion in nutrition research is, a research study can find a statistically significant difference. And I've heard Jeff Novick talk about this, where there were some nut studies where 2 ounces of nuts a day lowered cholesterol. And it was very statistically significant. You could definitely say that. It lowered it by such a tiny amount that it was clinically insignificant. If I said to you, you've got high cholesterol, and you looked at the numbers, you'd go, wait a minute, that hardly makes such a small difference. It's not clinically significant.
There's been a few papers that have done that, and there was one a few years ago that I saw. What was it lowered, using the Australian figures, it was lowered total cholesterol by
0.15.
Was it? And so, if your cholesterol is sitting there up at 6 and it lowers to 5.9 or 5.85, you've still got high cholesterol. So you don't want to go adding 2 ounces of nuts every day. In fact,
to try and lower your
and the
cholesterol.
clinical experience that Malcolm has is when someone's worried about their cholesterol, it's not quite going down, he'll say, lower the fat content of the diet, and it usually makes a difference.
Yeah, and that's a whole other story there. We wrote a little FAQ, it could be a couple of years ago, on good fats and what does good fats mean. And there's quite a few of the nuts that sort of don't really deserve the label of good fats. There are others that probably do, like, walnuts, perhaps almonds, flax and chia, but there's some that, don't have a great fat profile. I think when they've done some of the research, they've been careful about what nuts they choose. I think whenever there's a diet study that shows a benefit from anything, one thing that we need to look at, I think it's Christopher Gardner said this, and that is we've got to have a look at we've got to consider compared to what and paired with what. And I think a lot of the Mediterranean diet sort of olive oil studies have been suffered from this. You definitely choose a much worse diet to compare with. And then you make sure that the thing that you're looking at also has some other good things, something else, some other things are definitely good sort of thrown into the mix. And I think a good example of this is the Cordioprev study in Spain, the biggest olive oil producer and exporter in the world. Lots of funding from olive oil industry. That doesn't necessarily make it biased though. But anyway, Cordioprev study was an example of compared to what? Compared to a low-fat diet with more carbohydrates?
No, it wasn't.
No, the subjects didn't actually do that. They obviously didn't coach them well enough, or they didn't want them to have a really good diet. And then it was like paired with what? Well, in the Cordioprev study, which is often used even by some almost whole food, not quite anymore, plant-based people on why we might include Evo, this study sort of found some health benefits. But the subjects also ate a significantly increased amount of fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts. So, maybe the Evo did have some health benefits, but maybe it had none at all. It was just all the other good things that they paired it with. And we see this again and again in many studies. Sometimes it's sort of studies deliberately take a complex picture, like when some of Dean Ornish's studies, like his dementia study, he just wanted to throw all lifestyle and dietary factors and supplements that these subjects are also eating whole foods plant-based, and actually got some quite good results with people with early Alzheimer's.
You can be accused of can't
but
tell
people say,
what it was.
well,
Made
maybe if they'd had a chicken diet and instead of a low-fat whole foods plant-based along with all the other things. And yeah, he sort of was unapologetic. Look, I was just trying to do a more full lifestyle approach, not just the nutrition. So
why believe us?
Why believe us? Well, I think when we've looked at, when you look at the evidence, and I was talking to someone the other day, actually our immersion partner, Dr. Peter Johnston, and he was sort of reminding us that all roads lead towards WFPB. Now, I can't always say that they lead exactly there. Maybe they don't quite say that you have to eat no oil or no meat, but whichever type of research you look at, whether you're looking at whole populations and just observing, or doing some sort of diet intervention, or looking at clinical studies, Ornish or Dean Caldwell Esselstyn's work, for example, Dr. John McDougall, or whether you're drilling down and looking at what particular nutrients do. What does saturated fat do in the body when you start to put more saturated fat into a human body? There's some research done with our little squeaky friends, the rodents, who we probably know more about their health and medical treatment than we do about humans. Is that a conspiracy, Jenny? They're trying to get us to help them. Um, and I'm always very interested in the mechanisms behind this, and we know a lot about particular nutrients and foods and phytonutrients, the beneficial substances in plants and nasty things that come out of some animal products. We know a lot about how they sort of actually work at a cellular level, and I think that's important to understand as well. Well, if you're really a nutrition research nerd and you're trying to put together a coherent sort of science-based nutrition recommendation, like, for example, if you try and look at that low carb, lean protein, that's a bit of an oxymoron often, sort of approach to nutrition, you've got to sort of say, what does that do to the gut microbiome? Not very nice. What does that do to your blood cholesterol? Not very good for that either. What does it do to your insulin resistance? Well, you take out the carbs, so it looks like your sugars aren't as bad, but as soon as you put any carbohydrates in, you find that, your blood sugar, your body can't handle it. So I think that when you hear about these sort of high meat and low carbs, and the most bizarre thing is carnivore diet, and I don't think there's even really any decent research that's looked at that. It's just amazing that people want to do that. I would have thought that crystal meth would probably be almost sort of fit in with that as a weight control method, but I don't recommend it. Yeah, so that's sort of more or less
What do you want to say?
what I wanted to say.
So if anyone wants to ask us any questions, please start typing. We did put together like a blog post, which is on our website, so I'll put that in the comments after this live stream. And is there anything else that we were going to say that we have forgotten?
No, I don't think
thread
so.
while you were talking, then it's
think
gone.
so.
Yeah, so does anyone want to ask us anything while we're live?
I think, yeah. I want to make another comment. There's all this evidence from all different types of research, and it's been around for a long time. Like, it's research about what eating a lot of animal fats does to your blood sugar control that goes right back to like the 1930s. But there's a research going back decades, and that sort of point in the road that lead towards very much plant predominant, whole food predominant diets. And I think this seems to be sort of one of the themes of the How Not to Die documentary, which is sort of about the work of Dr. Michael Greger. But it's much more than that. It actually interviews, has sections with a few other sort of leading plant-based experts. And I think what I noticed in that, how this comes up, like, we've known this for years. It's like it took so many decades to get lead taken out of petrol. We knew it was damaging before it went in. It took so long, Michael Greger says, like it took 7,000 research papers before the Surgeon General in the US announced that smoking was really bad. But, couldn't we have done it after 1,000 papers? Like a lot of this science that we rely on, it's things that we've actually known for decades. And I think one of the things that industry and voices who would like us to think that we can go back to eating like our maybe post World War II grandparents who were made up the peak of the heart disease epidemic. Part of I've lost my train of thought there. Sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, all right. I spotted the question in the comments, which I'll come to in a moment. I think it's also getting things out. The perspective. We've often talked about when people, like, so many people are confused, and we Malcolm has people come as patients, people do our programs, our
Well, they do our
webinars,
programs, and then I see them
um,
2 years later or 3 years later, and it's like, I'm confused about
yeah.
nutrition.
And so it's how do people how can we convey to people, and our message is, focus on the big things that you know are going to make a difference to your health. Worry and stress less about the tiny things that may contribute to something. And we see this in the in the sort of the cancer space, that people are so terrified of the plastics and all of these things, and
The non-stick pans.
whereas there are like processed meats, your bacon, your salami, which are now being marketed on billboards at tram stops as being protein for athletes. The evidence is comprehensive about the dangers of processed meats and their link to cancers, and yet people are still, there's a massive section in every supermarket selling those processed meats. So, people can get very skewed. Anyway, so the question is, do we ever feel discouraged given the way things are moving at the moment, especially in the US? And I'll say we try not to be too discouraged, but it's hard.
No, I think I get a bit more sort of worked up and agitated, because I get worked up and agitated not just about the approaching train wreck of human health,
The
but
planetary health.
all the rest of it's the planetary health. Lancet laid out the science. These people who are promoting more meat-heavy diet, they're just sort of going, oh, la 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 la, whatever. Like, hey, has anyone got a right to tell me to eat less meat? Yes, just like they've got a right to tell you to burn less fossil fuels. Apologies for the air travel. So yeah, more sort of agitated, disappointed with the way things are going. I was actually surprised. I sort of like, is this really happening? Like, I remember I was involved with the Pudican Health Association in the late 80s. I sort of thought that maybe we'd become a bit redundant as we went through the 90s, because this is where nutrition was heading. I never would have ever guessed that we'd be in the mid-2020s and meat consumption would be increasing across the world, and the loudest voices in nutrition would be saying, eat more meat and dairy. But I get quite upset about, the planetary impact of this.
So it's an interesting question. Do we write about how non-saturated plant oils adversely affect LDL cholesterol levels on your website?
Look, it's actually it's very nuanced. I know there was the PCRM study of a whole foods plant-based diet, a high-fat whole foods plant-based diet versus a whole food plant-based diet with added extra virgin olive oil. And
Is that PCRM? Were they involved? Because
yeah,
it
I
was
think
Monica
so.
Agarwal was
Oh, was
the
it
lead
Monica Agarwal?
researcher.
Anyway, they actually it was a
Might have
crossover
been
study.
another group who were
Half the
funding it.
group did one diet, and then halfway through they swapped. And yeah, those that used the Evo actually ended up with worse LDL cholesterols. But the sort of, when you go down to the sort of nitty-gritty science,
Mechanisms.
very isolated studies, well, we know saturated fats raise cholesterol. Monounsaturated fats, they're so, well, actually they're not great. They're pretty neutral, I think, on cholesterol. And polyunsaturated fats tend to lower cholesterol, but they've sort of turned away from them in nutrition to some extent, because it seemed that there was other research showing that that they might have looked like they might lower cholesterol and things, but they didn't actually pan out all that well, unless compared to something. If you're comparing your polyunsaturated fats with saturated fats, then they look pretty good. But
There's another angle here, though, and that's food composition. And so if you're referring to a non-saturated plant oil and you're thinking of olive oil, it's 20% is it 20%? 15,
No, it's
15%
15%.
saturated fat. So it's like, they're a combination of those fats. And if you start adding it at the quantities that we've seen some health professionals recommend, like 3 tablespoons a day, that's actually giving you quite a significant amount of saturated fat along with the polyunsaturates.
Yeah, you're never going to get down to a target of less than 10% saturated fat in the diet by adding more and more and more of a processed food that has around about 15% saturated fat. Actually, and this is sort of, there's some things we sort of almost all agree on, like in nutrition, like more fruit and vegetables. Although there are some, crazy low carbers who are worried about fruit despite the research. And everyone's on about ultra processed food. And I ignored that for a few years, even though we never recommend highly processed food. I sort of ignored all that rhetoric because I thought, meat and dairy are trying to hide behind the ultra processed food, or previously tried to hide behind the sugar bowl. Interestingly, we would not recommend, a Beyond Meat, mince or something like that. But when they've actually done research comparing, and it's like, compared to what? Comparing, good quality organic, lean beef with some of these ultra processed plant foods that we don't recommend. The ultra processed plant foods still came out on top. And there's some other research into the ultra processed food, like some of the whole wheat breakfast cereals actually come out as a positive, but we'd prefer your whole grain was less processed. So that's sort of an interesting side of it, because you will hear often people who are promoting more meat and dairy sort of try and say that the processed plant-based products are much worse. They're actually not as worse, but we could do even better.
Just to finalise that answer about have we written about it on our website? Not specifically that, but we've certainly looking at the question, what are good fats? People, everything's good fats, good fats. We sort of unpack what's in the different fats. And whilst we advocate, if you're going to add some high fat nuts and seeds, lean towards using those which have a good omega-6 to 3 ratio, such as your flax, your chia, and your walnuts. But it's interesting when we often mix with other people and dine at buffets of whole food plant-based sort of preparations. What's the most common fat that's used in dressings and sauces? And it's cashews. And they've actually got a really bad omega-6 to 3 ratio and a significant amount of saturated fat.
Yeah, they don't have a great profile at all. And I guess that's the whole thing. We look at the total nutrition profile, but we also look at the sort of food matrix that it's within. I know dairy industries use that term, but we use it to mean, the food is, it is like a whole grain or something, or seed that's got all the shell, it's got all the outer fibrous bits, and it's sort of like a different delivery system to the gut. And so when we look at the processed oils, they lack that. Like actually in my career, I've seen a lot of people with iron deficiency. And, if you use 10, 20% or more of your diet just comes from an oil with zero iron, that's going to push you towards iron deficiency. And, one of the most common deficiencies is actually fiber. And, you're going to get all those calories without fiber, but also all the concentrated calories. And most people in the Western world don't need concentrated calories without any fiber or nutrients.
Question about sunflower oil. Yes, very commonly used. It doesn't have a great nutrition profile, does it?
Well, it's very polyunsaturated, so it'd be quite low in saturated fats. It must have a fairly neutral taste and be inexpensive to be used in so many food products. Like, I'm always surprised when I see sunflower oil in a sort of, in a something like
Ice cream.
well, in ice cream, but in something like a soy milk or an almond milk that is a plant,
A high-fat plant food.
a high fat plant food that's been used to make a beverage,
I just
and
thought it was economics. It's cheaper to add sunflower oil than it is to
yeah.
use the original ingredient, the almond or the soybean. Anyway, so I think we've talked for long enough. We can try and talk for only about half an hour, but we
Yeah,
might finish
I
now
think
unless
so.
there's
I think
many more
so. Yeah,
questions pop
yeah,
in the next 30
yeah.
seconds. We'll say good night. So thank you for those of you who are following us on live, and thanks for watching if you're watching this recording after the event. We'll see you next time.
Good night.
Good night.